Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. We are jumping back in here with a panel with Maria Wolter, Matt Breuninger, and Father James Brent on the striving for perfection and the formative power of the liturgy. So we're going to start off here with Maria.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So I am actually going to focus on Hildebrand, especially the chapter that you all had to read for the seminar, or were given to read for the seminar, which is entitled Striving for Perfection, and try to unpack that and his idea a little bit. So the title, Striving for Perfection, actually is sort of already the dead giveaway, namely that perfection doesn't come naturally to us. And among all of the earthly creatures, we're the only creature that doesn't just unfold and become what it's meant to be. Yeah, like the tulip bulb becomes a tulip, and there's nothing it has to do that. But with the human person, this is very different, because we are always human persons, and we are given our being in some sense, but there is another sense in which we can really fail at being human persons. We can become bad human persons. We can sin as human persons. We can be frustrated, we can be unfulfilled, we can be unhappy, and we can spend our entire life not really knowing who we are as individuals and as human persons. So striving means that you have to fight for something, that you have to work hard for something to achieve something. And so written sort of into the very heart of our being is the fact that it is a task. It is something that is difficult. It's a journey. And this is the consequence of freedom. You want it, you got it. And my favorite line in the Princess Bride is, "Life isn't fair, Your Highness. Anyone who tells you so is selling something." So how does the human person become perfect? What do we need to do in order to achieve perfection? And so I want to break it down into two things. The first thing is the object. So what object do we need in order to achieve perfection? And the object is value. It's intrinsic goodness. So it's not any type of goodness. It is specifically intrinsic objective goodness. And that's already an ancient idea. So that's already an idea that Plato develops. And Plato talks about this, for example, in the story of Gyges. So when Gyges follows his appetites and pursues his appetites eventually overcome that which makes him a human person, that which makes him, differentiates him from all other animals, namely his rationality and his will. So he becomes engorged, he becomes monstrous in some sense. And so when we pursue what Hildebrand would call the merely subjectively satisfying, so the mere gratification of our appetites, then we begin to experience a breakdown as a human person. That's when we experience precisely this frustration, this failure to be a human person, precisely because our appetites begin to take over, our lower nature begins to take over, and Plato has very many powerful images we can't go into at this point, but takes over and eventually, in some sense, brings down our reason and our will. And it's very interesting, isn't it? Because this is, you find this image throughout philosophy and also throughout literature, so that somehow we lose ourselves when the appetites, we become enslaved, and then eventually we lose ourselves. And it's a very powerful, I think, depiction in Dante, in hell. Dante has a hard time recognizing individuals because they're so covered by their sin. So he has a hard time recognizing who they are as the person, yes? Because somehow what stands sort of in the foreground is precisely the sin that they have committed. Now, this is very different when we stand in relation to the intrinsic good. So when we stand in relation to the intrinsic good, and as I said, Plato already develops this, but Hildebrand develops this very powerfully, the intrinsic good faces us and it addresses us as persons. So it addresses our reason. It can be known. It seeks to be known. It wants to be known. It wants to be understood. And then it calls our reason. It calls our reason to choose it for what it is and for the fact that it is good. Yes? And it addresses our heart in the sense that it attracts our heart. So it draws our heart. The beauty of the good draws our heart as well. And since Elizabeth took us on the pragmatic sort of tangent, just very briefly, it's funny because Plato, Socrates in the Republic makes sort of a pragmatic, he tries to market in some sense the virtuous life, if you like. Yeah, and one could do this. One could say, hey, if you want to be a good person, if you want to be integrated, if you want to be whole, if you want to be at peace, if you want to be fulfilled, if you truly want to be you, then live in relation to the good. And this will happen because the good allows you, it grounds you more deeply into yourself. It allows you to make choices from your center. There's no tempting, there's no trying to sway you, there's no trying to bypass your reason and your will. Yeah? The good looks at you and it wants you to be you and as you to make that decision. And Hildebrand obviously would be very careful about this. He would say, well, maybe this could be a first step for somebody to come into the moral life, but you shouldn't. I mean, there's much more, obviously, to a life in relation to the good than that it is good for us. As a matter of fact, if I'm just doing it because it's good for me, then this actually eventually begins to turn my relationship with the good in on itself, and it detracts from what it could be. Yeah. So the object is the good. And especially the higher levels of good, the highest levels, the moral good. Yeah, so there's this very interesting, Hildebrand reflects on this and he says, look, when I'm in relation to the good, when I respond to the good, I participate in the good. But when I respond to moral good, I actually become good, right? I become just. I become wise, etc. So moral good, morally relevant good. So this is the object that I need in the journey towards perfection is the good, intrinsic good, especially the highest good. Yes, eventually, obviously, God. We'll come back to that in a moment. And then the subject. This is the second part of this piece that we need to look at. So the to become perfect engages me fully as a person, as in my whole and complete personality. So in my rationality, in my will, my freedom, and also in my heart. All three of these are subject for this task to be perfected. All three of them need to be made perfect as a human person. And all three of them are perfected in relation to the good. Yeah? So reason. We need to know, we need to discern, we need to differentiate the goods. We need to tell if one is higher, one is lower, etc. This is the critical task of reason, not of freedom, not of the heart. This is simply the task of reason. And reason can do this. And reason can know, right? When I, for example, overreact because my husband forgot something, even though he was stressed and tired, and I react as strongly to that than I do, for example, to Hitler, that he made the concentration camps. This is disproportionate. This is terrible. I've obviously missed the hierarchy that we were talking about yesterday of the good. So reason has to critically examine, and I have to give a response that is due, that is appropriate to the thing. So I have to know how high or how low that good is. And this is incidentally very important and very difficult because we equivocate with this all the time, right? We got good gelato in Italy, etc. And then after we talk about a good husband, and then we talk about a good God. Actually, it's an awesome God. And this is always something that my father used to get very annoyed about. He's like, the only one who is awesome is God. And we should be very careful in how we use this term. Okay, so reason is engaged and needs to be engaged in this quest. And then the second part, of course, is the will. And now with the will, it gets a little bit more complex. So there's two dimensions, Hildebrand points out in this chapter, and goes in extensively also in his ethics and in other places. There's two dimensions of the will. The first one, so I'm actually going to start with what he starts second now. The first one is it is the creative part of the will. So it is the will that initiates action, right? It is the will that commands choices. It is the will that decrees movements, etc. This is a very powerful force of free will that it is able to bring into being. yes, an act that begins in my subjectivity. But Hildebrand points out that this is actually not a very important, or it is an important, but it is nowhere near as important as the second dimension of freedom. And the second dimension of freedom is cooperative. Yeah? And basically, I mean, you can't put a number on it, but let's just say about 90% of what we do is in fact not creative. It's cooperative. Maybe it's even 95%. What does that mean? That means that when we are brought into this, well, our freedom is in relation to things that are not in our control at all. It's not in my control who I am, what family I was born into, what skin color I have, what nationality I have, what time period, what religious freedom there is. My temperamental strengths, my temperamental weaknesses, etc. All of these things are given to me. Yes, and so. And this is very difficult, I think, especially for us as Americans to grapple with, because this is a dimension of freedom that we really don't like. But Hildebrand focuses on this very much, and he says, but this is actually where it all takes place, in how my freedom cooperates with things that are already given to me, my nature. I can't change my nature. I will always remain human. The good, intrinsic good, is not up to me. It is always there. And so my freedom actually is cooperative in the sense that it means that it engages the things that are there given to me already. And in this sense, though, it's still extraordinarily powerful. It can still do many things. It needs to do many things. It's called to do many things. It's called to sanction the good things in objects and in myself. It's called to, he calls, disavow, say no, to reject things in objects and in myself that are bad. And then it's called to the entire realm of this indirect influence that is actually super vast and super powerful and very important, that again, I think we really ignore or do not, we aren't conscious of how powerful this dimension of freedom is. So, cooperative freedom, let's just talk about this for just a second. Kierkegaard would say that the first step of cooperative freedom, I think, in this journey to perfection is a very simple one. It's the one to accept or to reject myself as a person. And so Kierkegaard describes this. He says that we can actually live in a continuous, daily, moment-to-moment rejection of myself for my entire life. And if I do that, if I live in a rejection with myself, if I dislike, if I'm constantly sort of looking down and putting myself down, then I can't actually embark. Then I'm not ready yet to journey forward. Then I haven't even accepted that which needs to be perfected. Yes? So in all of its brokenness, to accept and to say yes to who I have been given and the great gift that is. That's also something that John Paul II reflects really deeply on, I think, in the Theology of the Body. Then another very fundamental and maybe next step in cooperative freedom is the freedom to choose. Viktor Frankl calls it the freedom to choose my attitude. And Hildebrand is also about this in the ethics. I like to call it the deep space in Hildebrand. So Hildebrand talks about this also in his discussion on centers. It is my fundamental orientation to being in general. And this is another way in which I sanction or I disavow. I make a choice to be grateful and to delight in the good, to be open to the good, or I make a choice, yes, to reject, to live in a kind of constant rejection of that and to focus on my own good. That's very deep, and that's very much at the beginning also of this. And then, of course, you have all of the other moments in which freedom then engages this. Yeah. So, for example, so we've talked about reason, we've talked about will, and the third dimension that is very important for Hildebrand, of course, is the heart. And so the heart too has to be made perfect. As a matter of fact, for Hildebrand, the heart is maybe the most important thing, the most precious thing that man can perfect. And if man doesn't perfect the heart, then reason and will not be perfected. Yeah, so for Hildebrand, this is very important because the heart has a very central place to play in the human person. And so this perfection of the heart is very confusing because, well, my heart just kind of seems out of control, doesn't it? I mean, I don't choose who I love or when I get angry or when I experience envy or jealousy or lust, etc. These are just sort of things that pop up in me. So what the heck does this have to do, and how do I even begin to perfect this? And this is where now Hildebrand talks about, and I think he's very much aligned with, again, John Paul II in this, and with, I mean, Plato and all of the others, that perfection is integration. It means completion in the sense of wholeness and a proper balance of the whole person. And so the perfection of the heart occurs when reason critically examines the emotions, the affections, and the first thing that reason has to say and has to do is it has to decide, is this a bodily feeling? Is it a psychic feeling? I can medicate psychic feelings, maybe, and fix them in that way. Or is this a spiritual feeling? Because I can't medicate spiritual feelings. Spiritual feelings, if you go back or if you remember what he says about the heart, a spiritual feeling is a meaningful response to an object. Yeah, it's a personal response to an object, and those feelings I need to correct, and I need to. So, for example, jealousy and envy. Yeah, I need to know and understand something in order that feeling. There's an intuition that's born in that feeling that the feeling is a response to. And this is something that needs to be corrected through reason, needs to recognize that it's inappropriate. I should not feel envy, yes, at something good that happens to a beloved friend. And then the will needs to come in, and the will needs to sanction and affirm if it's a good one. For example, the love of my spouse, yes, that will die, it will go away. Hildebrand talks about this. Is the bad news about being a human person. If I don't feed it, if I don't foster it, if I don't keep it alive, if I don't nourish the flame will go out eventually. Yes? And then if it's a bad feeling, like if it's lust or if it's jealousy, etc., then after it's the will needs, well, the reason needs to recognize that it's bad, and then the will needs to confront it. It needs to find the root of it. Yeah, and it needs to try to redirect it. It never represses it. It never just sort of stuffs it in a compartment. It never forgets it. It never subliminates it. All of this is horrible and comes out in monstrous, awful forms and plagues us for the rest of our life. The will needs to cut it off at the head. It really needs to disempower it in a very active way. Yes, and then of course there's the entire realm of indirect influence. So many things that influence our feelings. Yes, I mean, Jim was talking about sleep. Sleep can influence the heart tremendously, can't it? Yes, sleep and good food and what we read and who we keep company with and what we surround ourselves with and how much time we spend on social media, etc. All of these things influence and impact the heart in particular. Everything. Of course, they shape everything, but especially the heart. And because the heart is such a precious place, and is such a difficult place in part to access, this is the one that we need to exercise the most caution and the most care with, not in the sense of, again, in a negative sense, but we need to nourish it and we need to feed it in a certain way. And I want to point out to you, what's very interesting to me is that in the Theology of the Body, John Paul II, when he talks, I mean, one of the longest sections, or the many sections that add up, and it's the longest part in the Theology of the Body, is his discussion on purity. And in his discussion on purity, John Paul II follows almost exactly this path of Hildebrand, that you have to use reason and that you have to use will, yes? So in building virtue, but also in this whole cooperative way. And then there, like Hildebrand, also now in the transformation in Christ and in this chapter that you had to read, at a certain point, and this already came up in the first session, says, and then there's only so much that's up to us. Perfection is not just something it's not something that I can just attain for myself. It's something also that I am gifted. Yes, it's something that I'm given through grace. And then also, though, I think very powerfully, again, this is always the very scary thing when you're married, and then they say, well, if you're married long enough, you start looking like your husband and talking like your husband, and you become like what you love. Yes, and it's very, yeah. So don't love a pug. You may start looking like a pug. Just kidding. But then love God. Yes, I mean this is in some sense where the highest good, yes, is God. And the more time, and this is this indirect influence, when we expose ourselves to beauty, when we expose ourselves to the good, especially to the highest good, Yes, we begin to somehow take this in. This is not something that I can grasp for myself. It is something that I receive actively. Yeah? And I can only receive it actively in the encounter. And so particularly with Christ. And this was for me, and I'll wrap it up. I'll wrap it up here in a second. But this is something I was thinking about today in the discussion on recollection and contemplation in the earlier panel. And the question, of course, poses itself, well, what if I'm not Christian and what if I'm not Catholic? Can I ever fully recollect myself, or can I ever fully achieve perfection? And I mean, there's a great deal that can be done when I am in relation to the good as good. But there is certainly another whole degree, and it's such a new and rich and whole sort of new dimension that you have, that what, the virtue on the natural level almost takes on another whole name when it becomes supernaturalized. Yeah? So when it's lived in relation sort of to the divine. So one last comment that I wanted to make is that, and I think that maybe this is important as I was thinking about it, striving for perfection is not perfectionism. Is that what we call it in English? Perfectionist. To be perfectionist, yes? And this is a mistake that we make very often. So many have a tendency, this in the first panel came up with like scrupulosity, but now perfectionism is not the same thing as striving for perfection. Perfectionism is fundamentally flawed because I think that I can be perfect. I want things to be flawless. And that will come up in our face and in the face of those that we love. Yes, that's not what humility is about. Humility is about accepting, in some sense, the good, but then transforming it. I'm sorry, I do have one last point. Hildebrand, there was one passage that did strike me in the reading, and it was on page 227. And I don't know actually if I can find it, but at a certain point, Hildebrand says that we should in his discussion on the heart and on affections, he says that we should avoid artificial efforts to awaken good, effective responses. And I was thinking about this, and I'm not sure I entirely agree 100% with Hildebrand on this, because I do think so. He says, to artificially try to. I have my happy face on today and I'm all happy. So if one does this, then afterwards that's very dangerous because then the focus goes on oneself and that it should never do. But William James, because he came up, he has a passage where he talks about, and he says that sometimes what the will can do indirectly to influence the heart is, he says, if I act, when you don't feel like doing something and you certainly don't feel like being happy about doing it, but it's the right thing to do. And where he says that if you act as if you're happy to do it, then sometimes that's precisely the push that the heart needs. And you'll be surprised, and then you will actually feel happy to do it. Yeah. And that was just simply one last thought to Hildebrand that I'm not sure if he developed that enough, but I would add that sort of to his readings. All right. Thank you very much. Passing on.
All right. I come from a long line of Irish Catholic women who talk a lot. I'm going to try to stay brief. And so I want to note, this morning I was giving a talk to 50 high school boys. There's a place called Catholic Family Land out here. And it's not an amusement park, I found. I'd imagine sort of these themed rides, but it's just a retreat center. And I was talking to 50 high school boys this morning, and I was decidedly nervous. I mean, they smell blood in the water, And I was just reflecting on how I'm sitting here in front of you guys, many of whom are like smarter, have more degrees, and I feel perfectly comfortable. Like I feel totally at ease, and I felt like I wanted to die this morning in front of these guys. So I'm happy to be here. So in my brief remarks, I'd like to focus on two separate but related topics that emerge in von Hildebrand's writing. These topics are surrender and the formative power of the liturgy. I'd like to discuss each with an eye to how current psychological constructs and concepts may be related to, and perhaps even help us cultivate a fuller picture of transformation. So within von Hildebrand's concern with transformation, the idea of surrender emerges as a foundational concept. Von Hildebrand begins to highlight the importance of surrender without using the exact terminology or language of surrender. In his description of how we can influence the development of certain virtues, he says, The essential moment here is, therefore, the free act of inner conversion, the central decision of our will to let ourselves be transformed by Christ without any reservation. The central decision of our will to let ourselves be transformed by Christ without any reservation. Here, the key phrase is without any reservation. We get the sense with this phrase that there's a total turning over of ourselves to Christ, a surrendering. We give all of ourselves and hold nothing back, as it were. Later, as he considers how God transforms us directly with his grace, von Hildebrand says, "But we know by revelation that God wills us to deliver ourselves to his action of grace expressly, to empty and to open ourselves so as to undergo it." Again, we have something here of a surrender, a giving up of ourselves in vulnerability so that we might be transformed. In considering this notion of surrender, to me, two types, each seemingly incompatible with the other, seem to emerge if we think about the nature of this giving over of ourselves. The first type of surrender is the type of surrender that happens when one is overpowered. It has something of a military connotation to it. One army surrenders to another when they can no longer fight and when they find themselves overpowered. Surrender in this case is often, though not always, for the purpose of not being destroyed. You give yourself over to a more powerful other so that you are not annihilated. The second type of surrender is the surrender of our self-entrusting love to another. This is the type of surrender lovers make to one another. Rather than being motivated by fear, this type of surrender trusts the love of the other. One turns themselves over to the other because she recognizes her good in the care of the other. There is, however, maybe a third type of surrender that seems to be something of a hybrid between the two. This type of surrender is the one that one makes to God. In a very real sense, the surrender to God is often accompanied by a deep and profound sense that one does not have adequate power to control the world and those in it. Nor do we even have the power, as Maria noted, to make ourselves good, sort of most deeply. It is a recognition that God is more powerful, in fact, all-powerful, and that we should therefore concede. The concession, however, is not to a force that is simply more powerful, but rather to a God who in his very nature is love, making it simultaneously a trusting surrender. This is why it seems to me that the parent-child relationship is the best analog for this type of surrender. When done in the context of a healthy relationship, the child surrenders themselves to the parent, who she recognizes as more powerful, but she surrenders because she is loved and can trust in the will and guidance of the parent. While von Hildebrand seems to place this surrender at the heart of transformation, little discussion is given to some of the psychological and emotional barriers that often contribute to one's difficulty in surrendering themselves to another. Most commonly, these difficulties arise precisely from the parent-caregiver relationship. Developmental psychologist Erik Erikson posited that the first year of life, a child concerns themselves with the task of developing a general sense of trust or mistrust. It's a period of profound foundational work in which the child gets the sense that the world and those in it are either trustworthy and will meet their needs, or that the world and those in it cannot be trusted to help, aid, and meet their needs. Related to this task of trust and mistrust is a psychological construct called attachment. Attachment is the experience of felt security between a child and a caregiver. Attachment can either be secure or insecure. A secure attachment is formed when a caregiver responds to a child with attunement, warmth, and consistency. So attunement here means accurately seeing the needs of the child. Warmth means responding sort of empathically, and consistently means time and time again responding, right, with this attuned, warm response. When these criteria are met, the child learns to experience a trusting security with their caregiver, a security that they feel in their body. Secure attachment is not merely intellectual knowledge, but it's felt. This type of security allows the child to surrender themselves and to entrust themselves to the caregiver, not simply by demand or force, but with a trusting, secure surrender, which has been fostered by the caregiver's loving response. If a child fails to learn this type of loving surrender, they may still learn to surrender themselves to others, but it will almost always be done in fear, trepidation, and out of a desire to avoid being destroyed by a more powerful other. This does not seem like the right criteria for the type of surrender required for our transformation. Why? Because this type of surrender is aimed at avoiding being destroyed. It's only in surrendering in a trusting love that we are willing to be transformed. That is, to have our false selves destroyed because we trust the other. So a number of studies have shown the way that we experience God as an attachment figure. So we have parent-child attachment, right? This felt security. Study after study has now shown that the best predictor of your attachment to God, because God can be an attachment figure, a divine caregiver. Study after study shows that your attachment to God is most frequently patterned off of your parent-child attachment. So if you have a secure attachment to your parents, you tend to have a secure attachment to God. If you have an insecure attachment to your parents, you tend to have an insecure attachment to God. In psychology, this is called the Correspondence Hypothesis. So the parent-child relationship is crucial for creating the kind of cognitive template that best situates the child to experience God in a safe and trusting way. Without such a template, without this attachment security, surrender to God and a loving trust can be incredibly difficult. Often one will turn themselves over with reservation only. So it seems to me, the reason I bring this up is because it seems like when we talk about, von Hildebrand very easily talks about just surrendering oneself to God. And I think very often this is a sticking point for people. It's very difficult to give oneself over. Why is that? It seems to me it's oftentimes because we have these templates, cognitive and emotional templates for how we turn ourselves over to our primary caregivers. And if we were met with distance, emotional coldness, withdrawal, anger, right, it can make the idea of surrendering ourselves to God very difficult psychologically. What do we do if we have an insecure attachment to God? How might we foster a feeling of security and trust between ourselves and a divine caregiver? Here I think von Hildebrand offers an insight, the holy sacrifice of the Mass. Von Hildebrand notes the deepest transformation of our being issues from the holy sacrifice of the Mass. The Mass offers, with all of its eternal beauty and the absolute holiness of God, presented in the person of Christ, a particularly appropriate way to evoke our love. Like other high values, it has the power to transform us. So what exactly can the Mass do to help transform our insecure attachment? As a side note here, I'll be focusing not on the very deepest sort of transformation of our being here, but I'm focusing on sort of the transformation of our psychology that will allow us to be receptive to Christ and His grace so that we might be more fully transformed. So let's turn back to attachment really quickly. Attachment is the felt security provided by a caregiver during times of threat or distress. So there's these great videos of watching attachment in children. So what you do is you put a baby in a room and you have a stranger walk in. It's called the strange situation. And you have a stranger walk in and you have the mother or caregiver leave. And the first thing you're looking for is separation anxiety. A child who's securely attached to their caregiver should become distressed or dysregulated when a new person comes in and when their caregiver leaves. So you want to see the child cry. And they do, right? I mean, these videos are horrifying, right? And they do this for 2 minutes, right? They let the child cry for 2 minutes. The stranger tries to console the child. A stranger should not be able to console a child who has a secure attachment to their caregiver. Then the caregiver, the mother or father, comes back into the room, and what you're watching for is what's called the reunion. The distressed child should be able to be picked up and comforted by the parent almost immediately. If a child has an insecure attachment, you tend to see one of two things. Either the child wants to avoid the caregiver, crawling away from them and avoiding them, or the child will go up into the caregiver's arms but remain extremely distressed. So we call this an ambivalent attachment, where the child wants to be close but doesn't experience the caregiver as consoling. But what's important is you see attachment behaviors activated in times of threat or distress. So this morning I was watching, we have a 10-month-old, and we just got a puppy. And so we're all sitting around in the living room, and the puppy gets let out of the cage and comes over to the 10-month-old who's sitting on the ground and just starts, licking, pawing, batting him in the face. And you see the distress. I mean, this is, like my 10-month-old has never seen a dog before, right? And now there's this big furry white thing biting and patting and clawing. You see the threat, and he immediately turns and orients to my wife and starts to crawl up her leg. That is a tremendous sign of a secure attachment. So there's a couple marks, right? There's a couple marks of secure attachment. If one has a secure attachment, in times of threat or distress, they seek proximity to the caregiver. They view the caregiver as a safe haven. They treat the caregiver like a safe base to explore the world, and they experience separation anxiety. The 4 marks of a secure attachment. So here's what I think is interesting about the liturgy, and this is something I've been working out and developing on my own a little bit, but I think the liturgy offers an opportunity. Now, von Hildebrand notes this, and he's right, that the primary purpose of the liturgy is for the glory of God. It's not for some psychological benefit to me. But I think an unintended sort of secondary consequence of the liturgy that's listened to and experienced and lived well is that it can actually form a secure attachment. The liturgy is sort of uniquely situated to help us form a secure attachment. But in order to do that, there has to be threat or distress first, because we activate secure attachment behaviors in times of threat or distress. So one of the things that struck me was almost immediately, right, we walk in, and one of the first things we do, we seek proximity. We walk into the very heart of the church. And we begin, as the liturgy begins, we start with the Confiteor. I confess to Almighty God, and most of us sit there, so I confess to Almighty God, you, my brothers and sisters, I've greatly sinned. So I'm saying I've greatly sinned, but we sort of just rattle this off, right? My thoughts, my words, what I've done, what I failed to do through my fault, my most grievous fault, right? And we just sort of blow through this. If we took this seriously, the experience following the Confiteor should be one of distress, I think. I've just said, I'm a sinner in what I think and what I do. It's grievous. It's my fault. And immediately I should be thinking, like, I'm in trouble here. Like, this is left to my own devices. I have one foot in hell. And so this to me, the Confiteor should immediately activate threat or distress for me. And I think what's beautiful about that, it happening so early in the liturgy, is it can then orient me toward attachment behaviors. And so what we have in the liturgy, I think, is a series of readings that through the Psalms, particularly like Lamentations and things like this, through the Psalms, through the gospel, they cultivate an image of God that is a safe haven, but also the cry of the heart that is separated from God in the Psalms. We can hear the separation anxiety. God, where are you? When will you show up and defend me? I don't feel you near me. But in the gospel, we have this growing narrative of a God who is a profound safe haven for us. And a big thing in I should mention, in attachment is sort of call and response, attunement. So they do, this makes psychologists sound like malicious people, but I don't think we are. But they do something called the still face experiment, where you take a 1-year-old, and the mother is interacting with the child, and it's all nonverbal. The child points, it says goo, and mom says, oh, wow, look, wow. And so they have joint attention, they're paying attention to the same things. Mom's mirroring the child's feelings. But then mom, for 2 minutes, has to go still. So she goes like this, and then she doesn't respond to the child. And no matter what the child does, mom gives her a still face. And what you see, you can YouTube this later if you're feeling particularly sadistic. What you see is the child almost immediately becomes dysregulated. The child starts to fidget. The child starts to make sort of high-pitched sounds, and eventually the child bursts into tears and cries and cries and cries. What's important about this is it shows that this attunement, this call and response between parent and child is regulating. It's important for developing security and trust and attachment. And so what I think is fascinating about the liturgy is there's a call and response dimension to the liturgy. There's periods where we cry out with our hearts and we get God's response. There's periods where God calls out to us and we're invited to respond. There's something of this call response dimension built into the heart of the liturgy. So we have threat. We've got a growing narrative of God as a safe haven, the separation anxiety. And then what's fascinating about attachment is really for the purposes of us exploring the world. So if any of you have kids or you've seen kids, if I take my child to the park, or the example with the dog this morning, once my 10-month-old felt safe in my wife's arms, he wanted to get down again. And he would periodically look back to make sure mom was still there. And then he crawled 2 or 3 steps closer to the dog. And the puppy got puppyish again. And then he kind of pulled back and looked at my wife. My wife was still there. And my wife said, you're okay. It's okay. And then he crawled 2 or 3 more steps. What you have in attachment is the child should be able to look back at the caregiver and realize the caregiver is a safe base from which to explore the world. Knowledge that the caregiver is there gives you the courage to go forth. And I think the end of the Mass, the Holy Sacrifice, we're sent forth. There's something of a go forward, explore the world, be in the world, always with this opportunity to look back to the liturgy, to the heart of Christ, to Christ himself. And so we even have this sort of the liturgy bringing God to us as a safe haven from which to go out and explore the world. Lastly, proximity seeking is maybe the most obvious behavior of attachment. You seek to be close to your caregiver when you're threatened or distressed. The Eucharist here, to me, seems like it's the strange situation, right? We bring God all of our threat, our distress, our hurt, our harms, our unworthiness, and he draws close to us. The way, if you watch some of these YouTube videos, the way a mother gets down to comfort and console their child and gives the child touch, presence, proximity, we have at the very heart of the Holy Sacrifice the most intimate of proximity to Christ. Right? He draws us to himself and allows us, and if we're receptive to it, we allow him to touch, hold the deepest parts of our soul. And I think if we live the liturgy, if we're present to the liturgy, if we allow the liturgy to be alive, it can shape our attachment to God. It can cultivate with us this feeling of distress and then move us through a deepening call and response, proximity seeking, ascending out always with the ability to look back to God as an attachment figure. So I think I love von Hildebrand's notion of the power of the liturgy to transform. And he has that entire book, Liturgy and Personality. But I think even here in the attachment dimension, for those of us who might feel like God is not safe, or we want to avoid God, or we feel insecure with God, the liturgy can be a profound and powerful way to allow the Lord to shape a secure attachment to him. Again, we can't aim at this directly. That's not the purpose of the liturgy. But it can be sort of a secondary effect if we allow it to be. So I just want to highlight those dimensions, how maybe important parent-child relationships are for not only trusting surrender, which von Hildebrand makes kind of sound easy. Oh, just surrender yourself to the Lord. Okay, great. I'd be a holier man if it was that easy, I think. But there's these obstacles and barriers that I think on a psychological level we can pay attention to, potentially identify and remove so that the liturgy can have a particular power on us. And I'll be quiet there.
Thanks, both of you. So I'm a new reader of Dietrich von Hildebrand, fairly new, certainly by comparison to a lot of the people here. I'm interested in him because I'm interested in personalism generally, and other areas of research include St. Thomas Aquinas, of course, but also a lot of the Eastern Fathers of the Church, and the Philokalia, and the Desert Fathers, and ancient monks, and things like that regarding the spiritual life. And I'm here to share with you, I guess, with the joy of a child's discovery, that I found in Dietrich von Hildebrand that he has really successfully reproduced the teaching of the Eastern Fathers of the Church about transformation or conversion. And I think he did that without ever really reading the Eastern Fathers. And I double-checked that with Professor Crosby yesterday, who told me that, to his knowledge, Dietrich von Hildebrand did not really have any kind of expertise in the Eastern Fathers or anything like that. So I'm going to share with you this discovery. But I'll begin with a quote. This comes from a Russian Orthodox monk, a contemporary one. Quote, "All of the ordinances of the undefiled church are offered to the world for the sole purpose of discovering the deep heart, the center of man's hypostasis, or person. According to the Holy Scriptures, God has fashioned every heart in a special way, and each heart is his goal, a place wherein he desires to abide, that he may manifest himself. So says Russian Orthodox priest and monk Archimandrite Zacharias. He's alive today. He lives in England. where his monastery is. Every human being has a deep heart, according to Zacharias, a free personal center, to use von Hildebrand's language. And it pleases God to give us grace, the grace of his indwelling, so that we might come to meet him there in the depths of our hearts. And to do so, to meet the living God in the depths of our hearts by grace, that is the main point of the gospel. The main point of all of the teachings and all of the practices of the Holy Church are this: to meet God in the depths of our hearts. Now, St. Augustine says something very similar, something strikingly similar, actually. In Sermon 38 on the New Testament, St. Augustine says this, quote, "Our whole business in this present life, my dear brethren, is to heal the eyes of our hearts, whereby God may be seen. To this end are celebrated the holy mysteries. To this end is preached the word of God. To this end are the moral exhortations of the church. To this end is directed the whole aim of Scripture, that the inner man may be purged of that which hinders us from the sight of God." It's all about the heart and the transformation of the heart. The transformation of the heart to such an extent that we can really know God in the depths. And that's what all of the scriptures and the teachings of the church and the doctrines and the sacraments, it's all ordered towards that. It's transformation of the heart. You'll notice how St. Augustine shifts back and forth between the eyes of the heart, and the inner man. They all sort of refer to the same place within. So the shepherds of the church in the East and the West, both the ancient ones and the contemporary ones, agree. The revelation of the mysteries of God and his plan for the world, and all of the practical instructions that go with it, they're given to us for a single purpose: to purify and illuminate our hearts, the free personal center in each of us, so that we might come to know God on the most familiar terms of love and enjoy his dwelling within us. Okay. Now, everyone agrees that this is a process or a journey or a pilgrimage that we go on or need to go on in order to receive this transformation of the heart, we can call it. The Western Church calls this journey or this pilgrimage conversion. That's the common expression. The Eastern Church normally calls it by the Greek term metanoia, which literally means transformation of the mind. Okay? Now, it may sound strange to us. It will sound a little bit counterintuitive when I first say this, but on the traditional anthropology of the church, the terms mind and heart, they differ in their sense, but they refer to the same thing in our inner life. Kind of like the expressions Saul of Tarsus and Paul the Apostle to the Gentiles, two different words, different senses, but they refer to the same reality. So it is with mind and heart and free spiritual center or free personal center. These expressions all refer to the same special place or power within us. Both of the terms, mind and heart, refer to what Dietrich von Hildebrand calls the free spiritual center of the person. Now, the term heart for us perhaps connotes affection more. We tend to just associate the heart with affection and love. And the mind perhaps connotes cognition more. We tend to associate it with knowledge. But in the scriptures, and in the fathers of the church, and in St. Thomas Aquinas, the heart is cognitive. It's also affective, but it's cognitive as well. And likewise, the mind is affective. It's cognitive too, but it's also affective. So the eyes of the heart know something or someone. And love is a radiant light illuminating the mind so that one can see more than one otherwise would without the light of love. So whether one calls it conversion or metanoia, something must take place within the person so that one might receive the riches of his grace, God's grace, and come to know the hope that belongs to our calling, and come to know, love, and enjoy God dwelling at the center of our souls by grace. So the great question is, what must take place? Many of the Eastern Fathers describe the event that must take place, or the journey or the pilgrimage. They describe metanoia as an awakening. It's a movement similar to waking up from the oblivion of slumber or sleep to the perception of what is actually going on and what is really real. American religious history, too, speaks of the various great awakenings that we've had down through our history. So conversion of the heart and transformation of the mind is adequately described as waking up. But waking up to what? In the tradition of the Christian East, and especially in the Macarian tradition, I mean, especially the homilies coming down from Macarius the Great, he's sometimes called, or Pseudo-Macarius, it's common to speak of waking up to the heart. Okay, it's the realization or discovery that one has a heart or a mind in this special sense, a free spiritual center within where God wishes to dwell by grace. As they understand it, as they commonly understand it, fallen man, as fallen, is submerged in disordered thoughts and passions. And they've categorized them in terms of the 7 deadly sins or the 8 deadly thoughts. Those lists you have seen, that's actually like an ancient kind of symptom, a list of symptoms of this profound disorder we have. Fallen man, as fallen, is submerged in these disordered thoughts and passions. The 7 deadly sins, or the 8 deadly thoughts. And it would be easy to describe each of these 7 deadly sins, or the 8 deadly thoughts, as 7 or 8 forms of submersion in what is merely subjectively satisfying. Okay? 7 or 8 forms of domination by disvalues. In such a condition, the fallen human being, as fallen, lives in the grip of a frenzy of automatic reactions to people, their words, their deeds, their bodies, events happening around us, circumstances. The condition of such people is characterized as being oblivious to what is truly important in itself, what is truly honorable and worthy of love, respect, and gratitude. And it's also an oblivion to your own ability to respond to such things, to the values, okay? The heart, the free spiritual center, is asleep, or the person is asleep to having his or her own free spiritual center or deep interior ability to respond to values. One is oblivious to being Capax Dei and having a heart, and a heart that's meant to be a house of God and a gate of heaven. So conversion, or metanoia, is an awakening. It's an awakening both to having a heart and to the whole order of honorable goods or values to which one must respond from the depths of one's heart, especially to God himself. Even after the initial awakening, though, to these realities, we call it an initial conversion or initial metanoia, the journey continues. To further the awakening, to advance in it or grow in it, many of the Eastern Fathers emphasize a particular spiritual practice that in Greek is called nepsis, or in Latin, vigilance, okay? In fact, they emphasize this practice of nepsis or vigilance so much that sometimes they're even called the Neptic Fathers, okay, or the Watchful Fathers, and their writings are gathered in this famous collection called the Philokalia. So the Vigilant Fathers, or the Neptic Fathers. They really emphasize the need for vigilance. Here's one small quote from Volume 1 of the Philokalia from St. Ezekios the priest. Quote, "Watchfulness is a spiritual method which, if sedulously practiced over a long period, completely frees us with God's help from impassioned thoughts, impassioned words, and evil actions. It leads us, insofar as it is possible, to a sure knowledge of the inapprehensible God and helps us to penetrate the divine and hidden mysteries. It enables us to fulfill every divine commandment in the Old and New Testaments and bestows on us every blessing of the age to come. It is, in the true sense, purity of heart, a state blessed by Christ when he says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." That's attaching a lot of promise to the practice of vigilance or nepsis. So from the writings of the Neptic Fathers, it's clear that they conceive of vigilance as twofold. On the one hand, it's a diligent guarding of the heart against all the impassioned thoughts that first stir up in the more superficial regions of our beings. First movements, they're traditionally called. But it's also the practice, it goes with prayer, of reorienting the eyes of our hearts more and more to God, focusing on God more and more, contemplating God more and more, with his help, by his grace, and that means waking up to his presence in us and all around us. So that's just a quick review, I guess you could say, of how the Eastern Fathers conceive of the process of metanoia and the essential practice, which is this vigilance. Now, so you can imagine my delight when I pick up Dietrich von Hildebrand, The Transformation in Christ, and I open to chapter 4, titled True Consciousness, and here's how the first paragraph begins. The inward progress in the Christian life is linked to a process of awakening, to an ever-increasing degree of consciousness. Conversion itself is comparable to an emergence from a state of somnolence, in rising from self-contained worldliness towards the reality of God, in experiencing the metaphysical situation in which God has placed him, and the new light in which all things and his own self are now appearing, the person attains to a new level of consciousness. If you had not told me that was Dietrich von Hildebrand, I could have mistaken it for one of the Eastern Fathers or contemporary Eastern Orthodox theologian. But then you turn to liturgy and personality. And in chapter 7, I believe it is, the title is The State of Being Spiritually Awake in the Liturgy. And he talks about different levels of being awake to God, and one can be awake to values, that's one sort of level, but then there's a kind of religious awakeness where one is awake to God, and this conversation of the different degrees of being awake leads up to a discussion of vigil, and how the liturgy is really vigil. And he is right, I mean, the Easter Vigil is, in a way, the paradigmatic liturgy of the year. So it's an exercise in being awake, staying awake, even into the night. So Dietrich von Hildebrand then goes on to say, this awakeness forbids us to be so absorbed by certain goods as to forget God, the first truth. It prevents us, this awakenedness, it prevents us from living so intensely in the visible world which surrounds us as to forget what stands behind and above that world, and in whose light alone all that which belongs to the visible world acquires its genuine visage. It is the awakeness whereby we do not allow ourselves to be absorbed by what is at hand, by urgent business and the day's work. It keeps us centered on God, his kingdom, our vocation, and the supernatural meaning of our lives. In one word, it is the awakeness which is a dwelling in the presence of God and abiding in his light. Both dimensions are interlinked. The more we live with our gaze fixed on God, abide in the consciousness of this only true world and our own fundamental situation, and see everything in that light, the more we are open and receptive, the more does the deep content of all that falls under our spiritual eyes speak to us, and the more acute is our ear for hearing the voice of God. From this awakeness organically follows also the knowledge of the dangers threatening our ultimate vocation and the need to keep watch over temptations. That could have been a passage in the Philokalia or something very close to it, okay? It strikes me as amazing that Dietrich von Hildebrand was able to really reproduce, using his own philosophical and theological and spiritual reflection or his approach, he could reproduce their teaching and hand it on to us, so to speak, at our time and our place in history as Western Christians and Catholics. So it's just amazing to me that he did that, and I wanted to share that with you and hope it could open up some discussion of it. I was even, wanting to just focus on, notice how he uses like the spiritual eyes. Like, where are the spiritual eyes? Is that different from reason? Is it the intuitivity of the heart? Is the heart cognitive for Dietrich von Hildebrand? Those sorts of questions. But I do want to make one final point about this and connect it with the liturgy. He says that the liturgy is the place where we're fully awake. And it's not just that it helps us to become awake. Yes, it does do that. But it's like the place where the church is fully awake. Fully awake to God, to Christ, and to the values of God in Christ. And just to maybe bring up again a point I made yesterday during the Q&A and give you a sense of what that might mean. Let's just take, for example, the situation, which is perhaps unusual for most of us, but the situation where of going to Mass without receiving Holy Communion. A lot of people today, a lot of Catholics today would think, well, what's the point? The main reason to go, they think, is to get Holy Communion. But in fact, if you think about it, using von Hildebrand's sort of value theory, what's God worth just because he's God? Isn't he worth it? Isn't God worth it that we would first take the trouble just to go to Mass? Isn't he worth it? Isn't God worth our penitential, our act of contrition in the penitential rite? Isn't God worth it? Doesn't he deserve that response from us? Isn't God worth our praise and glory, our responses of praise and adoration in the Gloria, for example? Isn't God worth just listening to and hearing in the readings and in the gospel and in the homily? The liturgies of the East have that great, way of introducing the readings. Wisdom, be attentive. Isn't God worth that? Isn't he worth going through the Eucharistic prayer and rendering to him adoration, praise, thanksgiving, and interceding? Isn't he worth all that? Aren't those the right responses to God just because he's God? If you get that, then you, I think, get what von Hildebrand means when he says it's in the liturgy that the church is really awake to the value of God, the absolute value of God. It's not about us. It's not about what we're going to get out of it or anything like that. Although, in his goodness, it also pleases him to give us Holy Communion. Okay? But I think it helps to maybe prescind from that and just think about the responsiveness to God in the liturgical activity itself. And you can start to see, okay, yeah, in order to appreciate that, you really need to be awake to the value and the worth of God. That's all.
Thank you all. That was really illuminating. And I particularly appreciated how you each talked about something completely different, but also talked about the same thing at the same time. It just all fit together really well. But I want to open the floor up for questions that I know that you all have. Looks like there's a microphone ready in the back. Do we need it? Oh, there we go, Bridget.
Thank you very much to each of you for your presentations. I particularly liked, Matt, your presentation about secure attachment. I believe, and my theory is that when we go to Eucharistic adoration, we are in the presence of God, obviously, but there's secure attachment there, so that Jesus is always there, he's always waiting, he will always listen to us, and that red light is the reminder of that. And furthermore, in relation to the way a caregiver can help a person, a baby or a child, regulate their emotions and their nervous system, I believe that when we're in the presence of Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament, our nervous system is also regulated. There's a physical change that occurs in us, in our brain, in our system, as we're adoring the Lord, or even if we're just sitting there. Would you have anything to add to that from your experience or your reading?
No,
Thank you.
Yeah, that seems right to me. I think, or at least it can be. I think sometimes what's nice about the liturgy in particular is maybe one of the challenges with adoration is we can, in the old psychodynamic language, they might use the language of projection, or I know somebody. So I have the beautiful opportunity of sitting with people in therapy and counseling, and getting we talked a lot about the heart. It seems to me that that's oftentimes the place that people will allow me to step into with them. But I've known some people who have had panic attacks in adoration, and part of it is because they're bringing a certain image or pattern or template for relating to God into adoration with them. And so it seems like what they oftentimes do is they sort of assume that the God in front of them is going to respond to them like their dad. That maybe God, so I found this in myself. My dad he's a great man in many ways, but he's from inner city Philadelphia. He's like a tough dude. Mick Breuninger is a tough dude. And he worked in a prison, maximum security prison, for 20 years. He's like not the guy you bring feelings to. You know what I mean? Like, Dad, I feel scared. My dad's response for feeling scared was some version of, go stick your finger in the chest of that person and tell them, if you continue, I'm gonna. And I was like in 6th grade, and I was like, oh my gosh. Like, so what I learned was there's certain thing that you don't bring to Dad. You just don't. And so I realized at one point in my early 20s that I had this prayer I'd say every night. I hit my knees, I'd say, thank you, God, for today. I'm so grateful. Thank you for all the good things. And I realized one day that it was a total and absolute lie. Like, I was miserable. I wasn't happy. I was kind of frustrated with God. I felt totally dissatisfied. But that's not how you interact with your Father. Like, I didn't have a pattern or template for bringing my heart to God. To being attentive. I mean, hopefully what I do with my kids is I show them that I want to see those places and spaces as much as it's humanly possible as their Father, like their heart, to hold it. I think sometimes adoration can be a little tricky because people bring in with them this pattern or template for how they think God might react or respond to them. So I think what you're saying can be true. And I certainly think there's dimensions of adoration. It's oftentimes quiet. You're oftentimes alone. You know, it's a beautiful space. A lot of it speaks of intimacy. And so I think it can be a sort of healing, sort of secure attachment place. But I think the liturgy seems to be maybe more robustly able to do it. But certainly adoration could, yeah. Sorry for rambling.
I'll go Jim and then you, Dana.
This is sort of, I guess, a question for Matt too. And I as as you were talking, I was thinking of Anna Maria Rizzuto's book, The Birth of the Living God, and the way that we have God images inside of us that we get from our parents and things like that, and that if that image is not true to who God really is, we're in big trouble. And there's a lot of reworking that needs to get done. But as you were speaking, I was thinking back to Professor Crosby, you here? There you are. I was thinking back to your comment this morning talking about the abandoned child. And that, I think the comment you made was that in an abandoned child, where there's really kind of true and pervasive abandonment, that the sort of organ of receiving love, and I think you actually used the word attachment, can be destroyed, just gone altogether. And I'm wondering what you thought of that in terms of attachment. You both sort of addressing that issue of attachment, and both of you, in a sense, were talking about secure versus no attachment. Yeah. Bowlby's the wire mother, where there's just kind of nothing there to attach to. But I wonder what you would think about that organ of receiving love and attachment. Can it be destroyed? Can it be so badly damaged that there is no resolving, a sort of coming around again? And what does that mean vis-a-vis God?
Yeah. So I would say, and I'm happy to hear others' thoughts. I would think there are probably rare cases in which the organ is maybe in some sense damaged. But so I don't think that abandonment, I've worked with, clients and children who have had severe trauma, abuse, neglect. One particular example comes to mind, a 5-year-old boy I was working with who'd been placed in the foster care system, who was removed from a family under horrendous conditions. And I was supposed to do play therapy with him, and I didn't quite understand what play therapy was about. And the idea is you're trying to look for patterns and themes, and you can actually adjust their way of seeing the world through play. But I wasn't making much progress, and my supervisor said, what it's really about is you're waiting for this child to become close enough to you to dysregulate. You want them to feel attached and secure enough with you that they dysregulate, and then your job is to help them learn how to re-regulate. You're laying down these new neural patterns of regulation, self-regulation. And wouldn't you know, the day I had asked her that question, he came in and he lost his mind. And this 5-year-old little boy destroyed the waiting room. Picked chairs up, threw them across the room, was spitting on me, said he was going to kill me. I was able to get him back into the therapy room, and he, just wrecked everything. And I eventually had to restrain him, and he calmed down, and I helped him pick things up. And at the end of the event, I got down on my knees and I said, hey, buddy, I said, today was really hard, wasn't it? And he shook his head. And I said, sometimes our feelings get really big. And I said, but I want you to know that I can't wait to see you next week, okay? I said, I know that was hard and scary, but we got through it, and I'll see you next week. And I was kneeling down, and he brought his body in between my knees, and he just laid his head on me. And he just slumped, this beautiful 5-year-old little boy. The level of profound neglect and abuse he had undergone. I say all of this to say, do I think that abandonment, abuse, and neglect can severely harm that ability to receive? It can. Do I think that it can ever utterly destroy it? I don't. So it seems to me that what we can have are, generally the way they talk about this in the literature is they're called internal working models. Internal working models they're robust, they're difficult, they don't change easily, but with consistency, with time, with patience, with adequate love, with adequate response, they can eventually be changed. I would imagine the only cases of that organ being damaged, I'm thinking about psychopathy, psychopaths, maybe severe sociopaths, that ability to receive at that level could be damaged. But I don't think abuse and neglect or abandonment alone are enough. They make it very hard, but I don't think they would ever destroy completely that ability to be receptive. That's my thought.
Dana, do you still have a question?
Actually, if I could just respond real quickly. The Desert Fathers and the ancient monks talk about the thoughts, and they understand that a lot of these are habitual, the disorderly thoughts and the disordered passions that go together. And they do basically say one of the primary reasons for going into the desert or going into a monastery and devoting oneself to prayer as continuously as possible and to Lectio Divina and living in silence and confessing one's thoughts to a spiritual father and practicing vigilance. Like, one of the primary reasons for doing that is to eradicate these things. So there's been some contemporary Orthodox psychologists who've done studies comparing and contrasting cognitive therapies and ancient stuff, and they talk about reworking the schemas and the templates and the inner working models and all that stuff. And in fact, I've spoken with some contemporary monks that basically say the problem is when you do that sort of in the monasteries is almost that the techniques or the methods, the way of life, the constant prayer, the continuous silence, is actually so powerful that they have to be careful, because it can really open up a person's unconscious and all this stuff can come out and all their junk can come out, and they can, like, people can get discombobulated. So a lot of it puts some of the monastic literature into perspective, where you read about monks that kind of lose their minds and stuff. It's because that, like, they're being reprogrammed very radically.
One question for Matt and question for Father Jim.
You guys need to hang around with like non-philosophers more. Yeah, you guys, I'm like a novel. I'm a unicorn. It's so, nobody wants to talk to me this much.
I mean, the psychological analysis is very true, and what happens typically, I think. I was just thinking of an exceptional case. So it is exceptional.
Please.
But it's worth hearing what you would have to say about it. And I'm thinking of St. Martin de Porres, this wonderful South American saint. But he was a mulatto. He was, half Spanish. His father was the governor of Mexico, and the mother was dark-skinned, and he was dark-skinned. And so the father took off because he was humiliated by his son. And the mother blamed him. And so this is at the very beginning. It's your fault, the mother said to St. Martin. And so there was none of this psychological attachment whatsoever. And yet this guy was a saint from day one. And I would like to have your explanation.
Yeah, please, sure. Got it.
Yeah.
No problem, Jim. Okay, so somebody else comes to mind. So Saint Therese of Lisieux comes to mind. So her mother, somewhere very early on in her infancy, her mother is having a hard time breastfeeding her, gives her away to a woman named Rose in the country. She attaches to Rose very strongly, so much so that when Rose would come back into town, Therese would prefer Rose to her own mother. Then gets stripped away from Rose at about a year. But Zélie is, by many accounts, a very, very anxious woman. And if you read, there's a book by Mark Foley, called The Context of Holiness, where he goes through some of Zélie's letters and Therese's story of a soul and pieces them together. It doesn't seem like there was much of a secure attachment. In fact, it sounds like there was a pretty anxious attachment. Zélie dies. Therese latches onto her sister very strongly. Her sister promises never to leave. Therese at one point pushes her and says, "Promise me you won't leave me." And her sister says, "Okay." And then shortly after, her sister leaves for Carmel. And Therese is devastated. And Therese falls into this terrible, after her sister's vows, Therese falls into this like terrible malady. Something happens. She's bedridden. And she has an experience. She's calling out almost in this dazed experience, "Mama, mama, mama, mama." And she has this vision of the Blessed Mother. And it seems like Mary becomes, like sort of steps in and fills in. This is called the compensation hypothesis with attachment. So the correspondence hypothesis says that we tend to relate to God the way we'd relate to our parents, that template. The compensation hypothesis says that perhaps sometimes God can step in and give us a secure attachment where there wasn't one. It seems to me that it's in God's purview to do these things as he sees fit. We have Therese of Lisieux, St. Francis. I mean, Francis is this powerful example where his father's like, stop being the fool, come back with me. He strips naked and he says, okay, well then I have no father here on earth. I only have my Father in heaven. Like, he doesn't seem to turn to God the Father like, you're like my dad. He turns to him in tremendous faith. So I think these are exceptions in some ways, Jim, but I also think what we don't always have is, how to say this? We don't always know the profound sort of psychological effect on the person. I mean, Therese, like, it wasn't all gravy with St. Therese. Like, she actually has an image. She uses this image when she becomes novice master of not feeling up for the job. Like, she has very little confidence in her ability to be novice mistress. So she says, Lord, I will bury my head in your shoulder, and all the graces you have for the sisters, I will just hand them out behind me to them. Keeping my head all the time buried in. It's a very sort of childlike image. It's not maybe the one you would expect of like, Lord, like, I know you're there, you got me, I'm going to confidently hand these things out. And so I wonder oftentimes how much, as we move through the purgative, the illuminative, the unitive way, the Lord over time purifies some of these things. So St. Martin de Porres is certainly a saint, but how much did that image of not having a father, how much did it plague him psychologically and emotionally? I don't know. I imagine it probably wasn't zero, but Foley makes the point in his book, Context of Holiness, it's precisely those struggles and crosses and early childhood experiences, they are the context for us saying yes to the will of God. That rather than being impediments to our sanctity, they can be the very opportunities where the Lord invites us time and again to submit ourselves, to turn ourselves over, that those are our crosses. And so I don't think it means that he didn't struggle. I just think that it means perhaps he allowed that struggle, maybe. I don't know if he has any journals or writing, but he allowed it to be his path of sanctification. JP2, right? Everyone he loved was dead by the age of 20. Michael and I were talking about this the other day. Rather than allowing the death of everyone he loved to make him sort of bitter, somehow he becomes like more compassionate. His suffering doesn't harden his heart, but he allows it to soften his heart. And I think something like that can happen. Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe.
Did you have a response, Father James? If not, I have a question.
I'll pass.
Okay. If that's okay with you all. Maria, I have a question for you. You were telling us about the two dimensions of the will that von Hildebrand makes a distinction between the creative and the cooperative. And I'm fully on board with what you're saying about the cooperative being more important. But now I'm struggling with whether the creative has any place, whether it actually exists, and if you could give us an example of that, number one. And number two, if it does have a place in conversion and metanoia and striving for perfection, what is that place?
Oh, no. So the creative part of the will has a very strong place. I mean, it's all of the things where I move myself to action. And I mean, that's actually quite many. What I was trying to say with my probably misjudged 95% is that there's just a lot that's outside of our control and that we aren't maybe as aware of that. But I mean, the whole life of virtue, even in discipline and things like that, and moving myself to exercise control and make penances, have actually, I'm there in some sense. You could maybe say I'm doing both because I'm using my creative will to bring about a new situation, but also that constitutes simultaneously a kind of an indirect. So it's indirectly influencing my personality. So that through these exercises, these motions that I'm performing, this indirectly also impacts who I am becoming. And so, yeah, no, I mean, the creative dimension of freedom is an extraordinarily important and an extraordinarily powerful one. Yeah.
And so that's not moved by some good outside of me. I'm not responding to something outside of myself. Is that the distinction that's being made here?
So, So in the cooperative dimension of freedom, I'm dealing already with something that is there in some sense, and I'm trying to I am interacting with something that is there. Whereas in the creative dimension, I mean, if I invent the light bulb, or if I mean, these are creative things where I'm moving beyond what is already given. And in some sense, I don't know. I mean, this is interesting. I'm thinking, kind of processing as I'm speaking. But to a certain extent, I mean, for example, we're born with temperaments, and we're born with certain, character traits, one could say. But then this is through performing certain actions. And through learning to overcome certain things. I think there's a great way in which we can actually completely transform, like St. Ignatius of Loyola, for example. And develop a whole new temperament that would have been inconceivable, And so the power of the will, and this is something that Enlightenment really focused on. The Enlightenment got really enamored with I think the creative dimension of the power of freedom to change myself, and this is true. I mean, there's an incredible power to do that. But the difficulty is that when I then take so much control that anything that's not in my control becomes an enemy to my freedom, then I lose perspective of the whole dimension of inner freedom, or the whole dimension of freedom that goes far beyond that. Does that?
Yeah, that helps. Thank you.
Okay.
I think we're actually going to wrap up now, so you all have time for small groups. Thank you all so much. A very interesting panel discussion.